and poetry.
Welcome back. I'm very pleased to open this afternoon's session by welcoming Samir Haddad, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Comparative Literature at Princeton University. A specialist in the work of Jacques Derrida, Sam is the author of Derrida and the Inheritance of Democracy from Indiana, as well as co-editor of Foucault/Derrida, 50 years later, The Futures of Genealogy, Deconstruction, and Politics, published with Columbia. Sam has published a number of articles on Derrida and social and political philosophy, and more recently on pedagogy and education. The title of his talk today is More Than One Language to Come. Please welcome Sam.
So I want to echo everyone else's thanks to Katie and Rodrigo for the invitation both to present a paper and to be here. And I want to thank them also for the work they've done in organizing the conference and sort of not only the work prior to the conference, which we didn't see, but all the work they're doing right now, which we're not seeing either because it's effortless. It's a little bit, I was thinking it's a little bit like when we judge, one way of judging a translation is that it doesn't really appear, or it just seems effortless, and I think that's what they've been doing. But we also know that actually it's a lot of effort. So thanks for that. And similarly to both of them and to Jeff as well for this, which also is a beautiful object, so it just seems to kind of be there without much trouble, but I've been hearing there was a lot of trouble, not surprisingly, but thank you. So before I begin, I just want to note that when I was writing this paper, I didn't realize that I was in fact conforming to a very precise genre, which was that of the afterword. At least that's how I feel having listened to the 7 or 8 papers so far. Because I've realized that what I'm presenting to you now, it really would be the kind of thing if I was sent all the papers in advance and I was asked to comment on them and provide some kind of response, because the paper I'm going to give, what it tries to, or what it ends up doing, but it just seems to me to be a kind of an attempt at a synthesis of a lot of what's been said without quite realizing it, and not leaving a lot out, of course. And that idea of when you're giving a response, you take one idea from one speaker and one idea from another, and you try to bring them together. And I feel that that's going on here as well. And then also in the genre of the response, where there's sort of this one step that you try to make to bring it forward and kind of continue the conversation. So that's at least, I think, what was going on unconsciously. But consciously what was going on when I was preparing this paper and over the last 2 days what's been going on is a lot of pleasure, and I think that's important to note. It's been a very enjoyable exercise, and not in the least because it's been enjoyable to read Geschlecht III. It's been enjoyable to read a lot of texts around it, the texts on Heidegger again, other texts that I had worked on but had kind of forgotten about. And I think that's sort of an interesting phenomena that arises out of what I imagine and what we're hearing will be happening more and more of this archival material emerging, is that it allows us to revisit old texts or to visit texts that we never really read properly. I should speak in the first person, that I never really read properly, or even the occasional Derrida text that I've never read. And that kind of invitation and that kind of pleasure is a really nice thing to come about. And that's what this was for me, because when I received the invitation, I was happy to get it. But in my mind was, oh, that's not really what I need to write, and that's not really what I need to focus on. But not surprisingly, when I read the text, when I looked at the text before saying yes, and when I read the text after saying yes, I found that it's very much related to what I wanted to work on. It's got to do, I think, with what Peggy was just saying in conversation with Philippe about the kind of the shifting ground. So there's always shifting, but I think we'll be feeling it more and more. So what I want to do today then is really pursue this pleasure of using the new to revisit the old. And what I will offer to you is reading one part of the analysis of Geschlecht III, and doing that together with Derrida, a later text of Derrida that's already been mentioned and alluded to. It's been mentioned a few times and alluded to quite a lot, namely Monolingualism of the other. And what I want to propose is that we can understand Derrida's identification of the desire for a pure originary idiom underwriting Heidegger's reading of Trakel. So Derrida identifies that. Whether he's right in identifying that is another thing, but I think that's pretty clear, and I want to trace that out. So we can understand that as putting its stamp on the desire that Derrida himself articulates in what have always appeared to me to be the incredibly obscure final pages of Monolingualism of the Other. Now, in doing this, I hope to avoid the trap that Francisco spoke of yesterday of the genealogist who's very secure in thinking that he understands lines of influence. So I'm hoping not to do that, although perhaps I do, we'll see. So I'll begin by providing an outline of the thread that interests me in Geschlecht III, and so this is this identification of this desire for the pure idiom. And I see this as taking place as involving three main steps in the text, although they're not exactly sequential, more or less, but the text moves around a little bit, but I'll present them sequentially just to kind of make things clearer. So the first step begins in the patient reading of those first few pages of Heidegger's Language in the Poem, which we've been discussing, Derrida's patient reading of that, where Derrida proposes that the unspoken Gedicht, which Heidegger described as underlying all of Trakel's poetry, should be understood as a singular idiom. So Rodrigo spoke about this yesterday, Francois also today, and a few other people as well. So Derrida's focus is mostly on Heidegger's emphasis here on the notion of place or site, the Ort or the lieu, and how this site is gathered into a singularity. But Derrida's reading of this movement also highlights the connection to language, when he writes that the unique marks the site in its indivisible singularity, the inimitable and absolute proper of an idiom. Now, as the Gedicht is unspoken, it is silent, so there's a question of how we're to articulate its connection to the idiom. And this came up particularly sort of today in Ian's paper and after in the discussion as well. Understanding the relation of silence and language is an old theme for Derrida. It goes back at least to Violence and Metaphysics, and perhaps earlier, I'm not sure. But in this text, how he casts it, interestingly, I thought, as an interpretive choice we face between, on the one hand, seeing it as a silence which belongs already to speech, à la parole, and on the other, a silence which is sung in the sense of a song which does not return or is not reduced to the articulation of a language, to that which in a language is articulated. So that's sort of these two options for thinking about the silence. However we make this choice, Derrida insists that the idiom to which this silence is linked is German in Heidegger's text. And this is because the Gedicht's unspokenness is not another thing or elsewhere than that which is pronounced in the poems. So that's a quote from Derrida. Because the Gedicht is tied necessarily to Trakel's poems, it is tied necessarily to a German idiom. In Derrida's eyes, German retains, as Rodrigo cited yesterday, an absolute privilege. And probably not only Rodrigo, but I remember you citing it. We see this absolute privilege of German at work in Derrida's short but fascinating discussion, and it is fascinating because almost everyone has spoken about it, of the role of the Fremd, or the étrange or strange in Heidegger's reading. And pretty much everyone discussed it. I think Daniel probably pursued it the longest. So Heidegger begins his reading by focusing on this, and this opens his discourse up to difference from the very start. And this openness is even doubled in Heidegger's kind of immediate calling into question of what is the meaning of this friend. What does strange mean? Nonetheless, Derrida argues that because Heidegger's answer to this question makes no reference to foreign languages, particularly those which, like French, participate in the Latin extraneous, and Derrida lists here straniero, extraño, strange, etc. And I can't help but say I was hoping that maybe Rodrigo would slip in the Portuguese into the text, but he didn't. So it's estranho doesn't appear. Heidegger reinforced, so Derrida's point here is that because Heidegger makes no reference to this family of languages that come out of the Latin, Heidegger reinforces the attachment to German at work in his text. So we've discussed this at length. So it's a question of, and what this means for Derrida is that the idea of the frontier disappears in Heidegger's text, or it doesn't disappear, it just never gets to appear. And it's now a question. There's a very interesting line here that I don't think anyone read out, so I'll read it out. Very short in French. Derrida sums up by saying, "On peut être étranger ou étrangère, fremd à l'intérieur." And I like that. It's one of these moments of an untranslatable that Derrida has to say, étranger et étrangère, and he qualifies the second one as fremd. So I guess in English one would probably say, one could say foreigner or stranger, fremd, from the inside. Anyway, that's the point. And then, as we've heard, this only gets amplified by Heidegger's immediate turn to the Fram, and the old High German, in order to then give the answer to the question, what is the strange? Is that the strange is to be understood as the one who goes forth, the one who or that which goes forth, ahead or wandering. So that's been discussed quite at length. So this is what I wanted to say is the first step in Derrida's reading, which is really just to align the Gedicht with the originary idiom in Heidegger, and to assert that this is unmistakably marked as German. Now, as originary, one might think that the proper place of this idiom and the Gedicht with which it is associated lies in the past. However, I mean, we know, and this is now what I think of as Derrida's second step, but it kind of happens at the same time, both in Heidegger and in Derrida, in fact. Much of Geschlecht III is devoted to showing how the Gedicht and the originary idiom are posited by Heidegger as to come in the future. So Derrida sees this move as a part of an omnipresent logic, and I was just asking Peggy how to translate this in the Démarche of Heidegger. I don't know how to translate Démarche. The omnipresent logic in the progress of Heidegger, the Démarche. The most originary is the most. Is that which carries the most of the future. The most originary is the most to come. Sorry, I'm translating on the fly here. I was a little unprepared. So, le plus originaire est porteur de plus futur. Le plus originaire est plus à venir. Now, as Daniel explained yesterday, and Francois again today, this already starts to be inscribed in Heidegger's description of the originary site as a site of departure, insofar as the fremde, or stranger, or the strange thing, is to be understood as a wanderer. The wandering movement beginning from this site lends itself to be understood as something still to come. But it's mainly found in Heidegger's talk of the West, the Abendland, or the land of the evening. I think this is where we get more of this sort of move to the future, at least as read by Derrida. As it is thus linked to a land associated with the end of the day, the West aligns itself more with an end to come than with an origin already past. More specifically, Derrida argues that this relation to the end that is to come is one that is best understood according to the notion of the promise. Derrida notes that the word promise, or Versprechen, appears only twice in Heidegger's text, or at least Derrida claims that. I didn't try to count whether it appears more in Heidegger's text, but I'm sure hopefully some people know here if it does. But in these appearances, that word of promise operates really as a crucial hinge of moving from past to future. So at the beginning of section 3 of his essay, Heidegger states, and I'm going to, with asking for forgiveness, I'll read from Hertz's translation, although this is one place where the sort of the erasure of German doesn't happen in the way that Jeff was talking about yesterday. Other than that, I'm going to read it in English, so it's completely gone. But an open region that holds the promise of a dwelling and provides a dwelling is what we call a land. The land into which the early dead goes down is the land of this evening. The location of the site that gathers Trakhl's Gedicht into itself is the concealed essence of detachment and is called evening land, the Occident. This land is older, which is to say earlier and therefore more promising than the Platonic Christian land, or indeed a land conceived in terms of the European West. So that's Hertz's translation. I changed it a little bit in light of the discussions we've been having, but that's more or less Hertz's words. So Derrida reads this by saying in the text on Trakhl, it's the word promise which is used to say, it's the word Versprechen, which is used to talk about the promise, that of land, or he says, celui du pays d'abord, das Land. So that of the land, first of all, the land, or das Land being that which promises the habitat. Then, and we'll return to this, the Abendland, which because it is more ancient or older. So I should read this again. So Derrida says, this is all Derrida, I'm sorry. The Abendland, which, because it is older, because closer to the dawn or to the origin, thus closer to the dawn of tomorrow also, like every crepuscule, it's older than the Platonic or Christian West. That's Derrida glossing what I just read from Heidegger. It's older because it's closer to the dawn, but he's slipped in that idea that it's also older to tomorrow's dawn as well. So the context of me bringing this up is that this is really this hinge between past and future. It's in the idea of the Abendland. So Derrida's reading proposes that it is through Heidegger's connection of the originary site to the west, the land of the evening, and his identification of this land as the most promising, precisely through it being the most originary, that propels its temporal location from the past to the future. The promise is what allows this land, along with it, the Gedicht and the originary idiom, to pass from past to future. However, so that's the second, what I'm calling the second step of the reading, but you can already sense that the sequentiality is not exactly right. However, the future that this promise signals is not one that is fully open. But Derrida argues, and this is now the third step, that it takes on the character, or perhaps it is better to say the stamp, of a return. The future that is promised is a future that is a return. So this is foreshadowed in a couple of ways in the text. Before Derrida really addresses it directly, it's foreshadowed in Derrida's signaling on the discussion of the stranger, that this is not a wandering without destination, but it actually has a kind of destination. So that's important for Derrida. And Derrida, early on in the text, just says, without any real justification, talking about that movement, that wandering, he says, this movement towards the proper is without doubt a movement of return, even if the return remains an adventure. So he says that early on, but he doesn't really explain it, but the explanation comes later. The justification he gives is the appeal to German. That's why he can say that it's a movement of return. And he also raises the idea of a return when he raises the idea of the Abendland, and in the kind of thing I just read, that because it's closest, it's the evening and it has the memory of the morning and it's closest to the morning to come, but that the return is kind of built in there. But really, I think in Derrida's text, the most emphatic argument for reading this future in Heidegger as a movement of return, it comes in the discussion of Heidegger's reading of the Ein in Träckel's naming of the Ein Geschlecht, which we've been discussing at length. So just to say a little bit about it, here Derrida focuses on the Schlag, the blow or the strike, le coup or la frappe, which Derrida reads not as a seal which would close, but rather as an opening and a breaking open, a frayage, its violence, or at least its force, being exerted as a piercing of a road, a frayage again, which is to say a fracture, or the effraction in view of a perspective or of a passage, of a way or of a weg. So that's Derrida talking about this. So he when he originally talks about the Schlag in that context, it's not a ceiling that closes, it's a ceiling that opens up a path. But, here's the but, Derrida argues that it remains a chemin de retour, a path of return. And he gives two reasons. And here, I've got a fairly long passage from Derrida, and I'm going to translate it loosely, which probably means wrongly. But it's on, some people have the book, and it's on 151 to 152 of Geschlecht III. So apologies to those who don't have the book. The translation I think I'll give is not terrible, but people can kind of follow along. And I think it's a very important passage. And it's the one citation I have that no one's quoted yet. So, it's worth looking at. So it begins, le retour, cela signifie selon la figure très problématique. So I'll just try translating it. The return signifies, according to the very problematic figure of the circle that I spoke of last time, it signifies that the most morning, and I don't know how to translate, le plus matinal, the most morning, I don't know if in English we have a word matinal, I feel like we do, but then I looked it up. Sorry? Matutinal, that's the word? Okay. The most matutinal, the most morning, whose promise is most open to the future, is what is delivered or rendered up to the oldest, to the earliest of the eve or vigil, and this is au plus matinal de la veille. And here I rendered the matinal as earliest, because the most morning of the eve is a little weird. But anyway, la veille is the thing. Why I wanted you to look at the text is because it's all about la veille. It's really important for Derrida here. So he says this. So I'll just read that first sentence again in my rough translation. The return signifies, according to the very problematic figure of the circle that I spoke of last time, that the most morning, or the most morningful, whose promise is most open to the future, is what is delivered to the oldest, to the most morning, or to the earliest of the eve or vigil. La veille, the eve, the vigil, is a good word here to gather together in French all these significations. Veiller in the sense of guarding and protecting and shelter, the vigilance and the watching over of the vigil, over what happened yesterday, I think it is. The most morning of the morning of yesterday, the most matinal. The evening now being in the land of the evening, the site or the moment when or where one ensures that, on verra, that one ensures that what awaits us and what is promised to us tomorrow on the eve of what we are. One ensures that which awaits us and what is promised to us tomorrow on the eve of what we are. The return thus signifies this relation between the veille, and I always say the vigils, but there's these two senses of veille at least. And the idea of gathering together, of the blow which gathers together the discord in tender duality within the simple, this gathering together is also a reassembling which delivers the return to childhood, to tender childhood, the oldest and the youngest. So I'll stop there. People can correct me on that if they have any interesting. There's a couple of things that I was tripping up a little bit on that, but anyway. I introduced that very long passage and sort of stumbled over a bit because Derrida gives us there two reasons and this is all about why this path that is opened up by the Schlag is actually a path of return. The first reason refers us back to his raising of the Le Schéma de la Révolution, which I don't think I quoted actually, but a scheme of revolution, which was coming out of Heidegger's discussion of the West, because what Derrida does is read the Abendland, the West, in the cycle of the sun. So that's sort of the first reason we've got. And Derrida refines the point here by passing from German to French, presenting what we could term the logic of the veille, which is he's capitalizing on the French translation or transposition of what Heidegger's doing. So the path opened up by the Schlag is suspended between past and future, an evening vigilance that both guards what is promised the previous morning, it's guarding from the past, precisely by anticipating what is promised to us in the morning to come. So that's, I think, the first reason of why this path is a circle of return or involved in a cycle of return. And then the second reason, which I just gave one sentence of, is further amplified by underlining Heidegger's reference to childhood and the childhood restored, which came up in Francois' paper and the discussion after Francois' paper. So that, I think, is a second related reason that's here. So it's this last step in which Derrida reads the future opened up by the path-breaking blow as being at the same time a return to the past. It's this step that provides the link back to the theme in the seminar, because we're in the seminar part purely of the text, of nationality and philosophical nationalism. Acknowledging Heidegger's distance from any simple or vulgar nationalism, Derrida nonetheless sees a link insofar that the scheme of return, I'm quoting Derrida here, the scheme of return is the theme from which is determined typically, and then Derrida says, I wouldn't say nationalism, all of nationalism, or all nationalism, or all of nationalism, but it's a word, that of Herkunft, without which it is difficult to imagine a nationalism. So it's an interesting move here, and I don't think anyone had quite quoted this either, is that Derrida's claim is that Heidegger is not that Heidegger is being nationalist in his privileging of the circle of return, at least in this moment of the reading, is Derrida. But it's that the idea of a homecoming is determined on the basis of this circle, and that in turn is the precondition of any nationalism, the idea of homecoming. And interestingly, for what I want to discuss in monolingualism of the other, which I'm about to turn to, Derrida nuances this claim in what follows. But he makes it clear that he does not see the circle of return as essential to the idea of homecoming. And he contrasts it here with an alternative approach that he doesn't see in Heidegger, and Peggy quoted this passage. And this alternative approach, and I'll quote from Derrida, is another line, that of voyage, of an open road or of the open path towards the adventure, voyage again, the path breaking, of that which marks the adventure as a new via rupta, a new route for a new habitat. And there, in the dependence on the movement of another line, we have, in place of the nostalgic repli, refold towards the originary habitat, colonial expansion. The future as adventure of culture or of colonization. The habitat cultivated and colonized out of new roots. So that was a fairly long quote from Derrida, but so it's a very interesting contrast here. That's not the path of Heidegger. Heidegger's path, this path of return, is a precondition of homecoming, which Derrida thinks is essential to any nationalism. But he does think you don't have to have a circular path to get to homecoming, actually, interestingly, because he says there would be another way to do that, which is the straight line of colonialism, that is in seeking for a home. So there's another kind of homecoming, which is not on the logic exactly of return. Okay, so I want to sum up. That's pretty much what I wanted to guide through the way of reading Geschlecht III, and it's a partial reading, but this line, what I propose is 3 steps, somewhat artificially separating them in the way of analysing Heidegger's appeal to an originary idiom in Trakhl's poetry. First, what Derrida does is he secures the link between Heidegger's talk of the originary site in which the Gedicht resides as an originary idiom, or with an originary idiom, and he further suggests, Derrida, that this is German. Second, through recourse to the work of the promise, this origin passes from past to future. Third, through analysis of Heidegger's use of the discourse of the West, the land of the evening, this future is said to be the future of return, or a future of return. And that's where we get the link to nationalism as a precondition of what would then give rise to nationalism, namely homecoming. All right, so let's take a breath and shift. Well, I'll take a breath. You don't have to take a breath. Just keep breathing, do what you're doing. Shift away from Geschlecht III and now to monolingualism of the other. So monolingualism of the other has been mentioned, and you all, many of you know it very well. And I'm not going to sort of go through the book in great detail. I'll just remind you of a few things. Published in 1996, but delivered, an earlier version of it, Derrida says, was delivered at Louisiana State University in 1992. And there's a little note at the beginning under that. I mean, the note at the beginning says that, and under that he says, and a prior draft, or a first draft, was read at the Collège International de Philosophie. But he doesn't give a date for that, actually. But I assume, I don't know. And I tried to look that up, but I couldn't, at least on the online archives of the college, it's not listed. But maybe if one looked a little further. But we're talking about monolingualism being drafted really sort of 6 to 10 years after Geschlecht III, and being written across a period of years and rewritten. So it's a strange little book, as those of you who have read it know, and you know, like all of the books are strange when you look at them long enough. But this one, I've been looking at this for a while, and it's very strange. I kind of find it fascinating, but one of the reasons I find it fascinating is just structurally, I just don't get it. It's presented as a dialogue or a polylogue, because the voices aren't numbered or named, and they're very sort of irregular across the text. It's made up of 9 sections of uneven length. I think it's 8 numbered things, which I guess are chapters, and then a sort of an epilogue, and they're very uneven in their length. Has this extremely long footnote which seems very close to what Derrida was doing in the Old Hospitality Seminar, which he was teaching at the same time this was published, around that time, so presumably that was added later. And Peggy had mentioned the hospitality material. So it's a very odd, very out of balance kind of book to me, but you know, most books are if you look closely enough. And I want to say this partly with this audience because I'm hoping someone will say, oh no, there's another. To me, it's the only book, so I'll assert it as strong as possible. The only book in Derrida's oeuvre that I can think of, apart from interviews, where he just doesn't read another text. He doesn't inhabit someone else's text. There's a little bit of citation, but no real reading of some works of Abdul Kabir Khatibi. There's a few allusions to Edward Glissant, and both of these people were in the audience. There is a reading of sorts in this very long footnote, but it doesn't quite belong in the book. And it's set up as actually, if I were to write this long work, which I think we should write about Jews in Germany and their relation, like, here's how it might look. But the actual text doesn't really read any text. What it does is Derrida generates a text through these seemingly autobiographical musings and reads them, as it were, and inhabits them. And to me, but in question and answer or afterwards, if you want to be polite, someone can say, no, there's this other text of Derrida's with that, but as a published book. And I find that quite interesting too, to think about what's going on. And then at the very beginning of the epilogue, Derrida says, this isn't an autobiography, it's a sort of an account of the obstacles that I would encounter if I wanted to write an autobiography. So we have to think about how we take his claims. Okay, so all that's to say, this is hard to read, it's complicated. But what I want to do is just very quickly, I want to offer another interpretive frame, a little, and then it's in 3. For some reason, I'm fixed on 3s in this paper. So I want to offer to you the idea that in this text, there are 3 monolingualisms of the other that are presented, so as a way of organizing it. And I'll move fairly quickly here. So the first monolingualism of the other that Derrida describes in his text is his own. It's announced on the very first page in the enigmatic statement that many of you know, that I only have one language, it is not mine. It's in the first person. Derrida justifies this statement by relating the story of his education and upbringing in Algeria. You all know it, or many of you know it, and it's very well known, so I'm not going to relate the story. I'll just remind you that it involves 3 interdictions against language, against the Arab and Berber, which he puts together as one interdiction taking place in the school. And these are the languages spoken by the large majority of people living in Algeria, who are subjects of the French state, but not full citizens. There's another interdiction related to Hebrew and the absence of a language belonging to Derrida's Jewish community, so not just Hebrew, but any other kind of language, at least for his, and this is interesting to think because it's a fairly narrowly defined community in Algeria of Jews. He's talking about his sort of, at his time in a fairly urban environment, there not being any kind of separate mother tongue for that community. And then the third interdiction being against French, okay? And just the first and the third are really tied to school and schooling. Okay. So Derrida has this sort of singular history, and the interdiction of French has partly got to do with the stripping of the citizenship of the Jewish community in Algeria in 1940. And this story, which I haven't told you, but I've reminded you of, is why Derrida can say, I only have one language and it is not mine. French is his only language, the language of his childhood, household, community, and schooling, so he's monolingual. But since this language is the language of the colonizer, a language from elsewhere, the robots are at work again, Derrida's monolingualism is of the other. This is his own monolingualism. Now, despite the anguish of this situation, Derrida's response to it is not to distance himself from French. Instead, because of this separation, maybe detachment actually, thinking of what Ian was talking about this morning, Derrida finds a certain desire sparked within him. This is the desire for purity in language, to be more French than the French, this is now a quote, more purely French than was demanded by the purity of the purists. This is, however, because it's Derrida, a purity which is not very pure, and this desire for impure purity manifests itself in the dream, we get the word dream, to make something happen to this language. So there's sort of I feel like this description of this desire reaches a kind of apex. It's a hyperbolic passion that Derrida has for French. And at that apex, there's the possibility of another French appearing that's arising out of both his love, but his encounter with the French. That at least is sort of the hope. Okay, so that's the first monolingualism of the other. That's Derrida's, but as you know, he doesn't keep it for himself. He wants to say we all have this. He makes the claim, he suggests that such a relation holds for everybody. We should all be described as monolingual, and none of us owns our own language. And this, I think, is the second monolingualism in the text. It's a general, he doesn't put it in these terms, but I might, or I will. He proposes it as a general condition of existence. Now, he supports this general proposition in several different ways in the text, not necessarily sort of dotted around. It comes in part, or the fact that it's a monolingualism of the other comes in part from claims about the colonial condition and the linguistic dimension of the colonial condition holding for everyone, or in particular holding for the colonizer as well as the colonized. And he makes the claim that all culture is colonial, and that way he can extend that sort of colonial condition to all. And he says there's an essential coloniality of culture, and everyone is subject to. So no one owns a language. Everyone's language is of the other. But even granting that, the question is, well, why monolingualism? Why are we all monolingual? And this appears in a couple of different ways in the textual justification for it. It appears in this, it starts getting justified in the second contradiction that Derrida proposes early on in the text. Namely, we only ever speak one language, or rather one idiom only, and we never speak only one language, or rather there is no pure idiom. So he shifts to the we from the I, there's a few pages later from the initial statement, and now you've got a different kind of contradiction between two statements, and now he's introduced idiom, which we talked about a lot yesterday, particularly in Peggy's paper, but in others too. So the challenge then is, why do both of these statements hold? Well, the second one's a little easier. We never speak only one language, or rather there is no pure idiom. That's, I think, a little easier for Derrida to show, because he links it to an assertion by Katibi, who's in the audience, who calls into question an absolute monolingualism by appealing to the active division at work in the mother tongue. And then, as in Francois' paper in the discussion, this came up too, Derrida extends this later in the text with his attacks on the idea of the mother tongue. Or not on the assumed stability of the mother that would ground anyone's mother tongue. So this is all to say that, and there's a few other things. There's the idea of, I should actually go through these because they're important. There's the idea that languages are uncountable. This is all to say why we never only speak one language. There is no pure idiom. Languages are uncountable. We can't distinguish between idiom, dialect, and language, these different claims he makes. And then the last one, very important, and I have to mention this because it was my title. There's the claim in the Prière d'insérer in Monolingualism de l'autre, but it didn't make it into the English, of the idea of the plus d'une langue. There's always plus d'une langue, more than one language. So this is presented in the Prière d'insérer as a citation from Memoirs for Paul de Man, which Daniel reminded us is written at the same time as, or around the same time as Geschlecht III. And there in Memoirs for Paul de Man, and I think Derrida quotes it on the Prière d'insérer as well, Derrida defines the plus d'une langue to mean both more than a language and no more of a language. So that, all of that does, I think Derrida, there's a lot there to say, yeah, why we never only speak one language, there is no pure idiom. I find all that very convincing. But if this is an aporia, if this is a contradiction, then we need the other half. Because at this point, I would want to say, well, we're not monolingual. Like, just give it away. But Derrida also wants to maintain that we only ever speak one language, or rather one idiom only. He also wants that claim. And I see him giving us two reasons. One is that it links back to the idea that all culture is colonial. And for Derrida, all colonialism and all culture that way holds itself to be sovereign, therefore. And sovereignty for him, and this is from the text, sovereignty always tends repressively and irrepressibly to reduce language to the one, that is, to the hegemony of the homogeneous. And further, second, Derrida argues that we are all beholden to this phantasm of sovereignty. And that's that's not a quote, but I think the word phantasm is in the text. I'm just thinking of the discussion we just had. Even those who speak more than one language. So everyone is beholden to this phantasm, and we all dream of this unity. And he makes this argument through recourse to language that ought to sound familiar. So I quote Derrida, "One can, of course, speak several languages. There are speakers who are competent in more than one language. Some even write several languages at a time, prostheses, graphs, translation, transposition. But do they not always do it with a view to an absolute idiom, and in the promise of a still unheard of language, of a soul poem previously inaudible?" So I hope you hear what I hear there, which is the reference to the reading of Geschlecht III. So at this moment, it seems that Derrida would really be taking over this structure he's read in Heidegger and using it for his own ends to argue for a generalized monolingualism of the other that would hold for all. And I think that is a kind of very crucial moment. And I think that's one of the hardest things for him to argue in the text. I think showing the dispersion of language is a lot easier, or challenging the oneness of language. However, as you might imagine, Derrida does not adopt the Heideggerian framework wholesale, or at least he doesn't follow Heidegger right up to the particular end he sees Heidegger following in Geschlecht III, namely the end that ends in a return to the beginning. Or as Francois said, if they're compagnons de route, Derrida gets off at a certain point. So yes. Or as Francesco was saying, it's really at the point of homeland that Derrida gets off. He's not going to go that far with that phantasm in Heidegger. But I'd like to look a little closely at how Derrida does that. How does he get off the route? This won't take too long. What we do need to do is they see in the text now, this is what I call the third monolingualism of the other. I said there were three, and just to see how that emerges in this final chapter of the text. So it occurs in the final chapter. It's where the citation I just made of, don't we all dream of this? Even the multilingual people dream of this previously inaudible poem. And what he does there is he summarizes what he's been doing throughout the book by speaking of the monolingual who is deprived of his language as, quote, so the monolingual is thrown into absolute translation, a translation without pole of reference, without an originary language, and without a source language, langue de départ, sorry. For him, there are only target languages, langue d'arrivée, in the plural. There's no language of departure or source language. There are only target languages, langue d'arrivée. So he says there are only target languages, if you will. The remarkable experience being, however, that these languages just cannot manage to reach themselves because they no longer know where they are coming from, what they are speaking from, and what the sense of their journey is. Languages without itinerary, and above all, without any superhighway of goodness knows what information. I mispronounced that. Without any superhighway of goodness knows what information. And as I mentioned yesterday to someone, it was to Jeff, I was teaching this the other day, or a couple of weeks ago. My students kind of blanked. This is a very 90s thing, this information superhighway. And very soon after this, it's the web, which is actually a very different kind of geometry of thinking about information. But Derrida uses it, and it's current at the time. So I'm tempted to gloss that citation, which I think is key, the idea that all there are these languages, target languages or languages of arrival, the langue d'arrivée, by saying that for Derrida the monolingual is all at sea, and that the monolingual is drifting from one target language to another without ever arriving at any shore. But Derrida doesn't actually use this language. And when I was teaching it, I found myself explaining it to students with this metaphor of the sea, but then looking at the text, I can't quite find it. And I'm not even sure if there is I was asking and couldn't quite get an answer from it, or no one could think of it on the spot, where there's a French idiom that would really capture being all at sea. In any case, I do think it fits here, particularly with the Mediterranean character of the book and the role that the Mediterranean places between Algeria and France for Derrida in the text. But from that point, and this is what I want to push to, it's at this moment, Derrida then says that it's in this situation when there are only arrivals, arrivées, that's all we have, and therefore only events without arrival, because it's simply arrivé, and it's an event. Derrida says, it is here that desire springs forth, a desire to reconstruct, to restore, but it is really a desire to invent a first language that would be rather a prior to the first language destined to translate that memory, the memory of what precisely did not take place. So that's Derrida. Now Derrida insists that, quote, such a prior to first language does not exist. It is not even a preface, a forward, some lost language of origin. It can only be a target, or rather, this is all Derrida, a future language, a promised sentence, a language of the other, once again, but entirely other than the language of the other as the language of the master or the colonist, even though between them the two may sometimes show so many unsettling resemblances maintained in secret or held in reserve. That was all Derrida. So this is what I see as the third monolingualism of the other. It's the prior to the first language, which does not yet exist and so must be invented, a language of the other that is a language to come. Now Derrida goes on to explain that its unsettling resemblance with the language of the master means that, quote, it can always run the risk of becoming or wanting to be again a language of the master, sometimes that of new masters, end quote. But this risk notwithstanding, or perhaps because of it, the call to invent another language continues to resound. So I hope you can hear how the schema I've just outlined is stamped by the analysis of Geschlecht III. The antidote, that's probably too strong a word, but that's what I wrote. The antidote that Derrida proposes to the situation of being lost in the sea of target languages is to posit a desire that would seem to be Heidegger's desire, or at least the desire he read in Heidegger in Geschlecht III. And insofar as we are all monolingual, and so all subject to or all subjects of this desire, we would all be Heideggerian, seeking to invent a prior to the first language as a way of responding to our situation. And in Derrida's risk of the identification of the risk of this desire, we see that the path that he thinks Heidegger followed, at least in the Trackle essay, and we've heard a lot, especially today, that there are maybe many other paths that Heidegger follows too. So that the path that in following this path, Heidegger arrived at a place where the language of the master returns. So that was the risk that Derrida sees. So this then leaves us with the challenge, or leaves Derrida and us with the challenge, and this would be, I would suggest, the point at which Derrida departs from Heidegger or leaves the road, which is to invent a language to come in another manner. And keeping in mind that other possibility that Geschlecht III raised, namely the possibility of kind of a straight line of colonialism as well. That's got to be avoided as well. Because Derrida certainly doesn't want that, especially in this text. So, I'm coming to an end. What does Derrida suggest we do such that we avoid reinstalling the language of the master through a cycle of return, the Heideggerian path, or avoid installing a master through the adventure of colonialism? Well, as the text continues, he insists that whatever way the forward is, it must be, quote, be written within languages, so to speak. One must summon up writing inside the given language, end quote. And what follows in the final pages of the book is a description of what Derrida does, what he has always done and what he continues to dream of doing, namely transform French from within by such a writing that would open it up to the coming of this other, or this entirely other language. Now, before I heard Jeff's talk yesterday, I would have glossed this as dissemination rather than polysemy, but I won't go there as a way of glossing what Derrida sort of describes, and he doesn't use the word dissemination there. But even without recourse to dissemination, I think you can guess the type of thing that Derrida articulates here, the thing he's driving at, namely a kind of an internal destructuration or deconstruction of language, governed by the logic of the more than one language, the plus d'une langue. So it would be a question of inventing plus d'une langue à venir, more than one language to come, with all the resonance of the more than one that this carries. And yet, and this is my last sort of proposal or thought, I can't help but think that even as he departs from Heidegger's path in this way, Derrida has followed him more than he needed to, or even should have. In other words, I wonder whether monolingualism of the other remains too marked, too stamped by the analysis pursued in Geschlecht III. For what troubles me in this final section of monolingualism is the rapidity with which Derrida seems willing to move without comment from a plurality of languages to a kind of singularity of the one, even as it's a complicated singularity of the more than one. And this move happens at two moments, which I quoted to you, but I'll quote again. First, it happens when Derrida shifts in the space of a few lines from describing the experience of their only being, quote, target languages, in the plural, the langue d'arrivée. So he says that, and then he moves very quickly in a few lines to the desire for a prior to the first language, in the singular. So in my metaphorics that I've imposed on the text, it's sort of between moving to being all at sea and finding a shore. That would be the thing. And then a second place it occurs is when Derrida states that the invention of this pre-originary language, quote, must be written within languages, in the plural. And then in the next sentence he rephrases this as, one must summon up writing in the given language, singular. So there's this shift that happens. My question and my desire is whether we can refuse the Heideggerian desire for only one language and remain within the many. Can we write in languages in the plural without our writing being governed by a thought of the one? Or in other words, again, can we remain at sea without ever coming to shore? Now, given all of the discussion we've had actually in the last few talks, but the whole time as well, about trying to manage this question of the many and the one, the answer is probably not. But I would just say that in conclusion, I'm kind of left in two minds, because part of me feels like what I'm after is actually already in Derrida, very much in Derrida's text. Maybe not at those moments I've just quoted, but very much elsewhere. And as we saw yesterday, and this was why I was getting very excited at Daniel's paper, when Derrida cites, or when Daniel cited Derrida's recourse to the Unheimlichkeit as the only way he could explain to his French students what was going on in Heidegger's text around the question of the stranger. That to me is being a little more at sea, having more than one language in a different sense just than the Pluden Long. Or better still, in Daniel's paper, since a simple crossing of the Rhine is perhaps still a little too confined and is still a little too landlocked, in Derrida's appreciation of Celan's passage from German to Austrian, as Peter reminded us, to French to Spanish in the space of a few lines. But even as Celan would seem to remain on land, the fact that these four nations do not share a single border on land makes me wonder whether it would be better to think of these languages relations that we associate with these nations as if they were together on the sea. So in these moments, and there are many others, Derrida really seems to be writing within languages in the plural, a different kind of plural from that of the Pluden Long, freer, if not fully free, of the desire of the one. So that would be one idea, is to really look in Derrida's oeuvre and find everything we want. Another idea, though, would be to go beyond Derrida's oeuvre. And in thinking of this, I think it's also important to think about, if we're remaining at sea, or if we're all at sea, it depends which sea. And there's more than one sea. If there's more than one language, there's certainly more than one sea. And the Mediterranean of Derrida, or the Mediterranean that so dominates in Derrida's writing, is pretty particular, or it has a very specific character in Derrida's writing, and beyond it. And it's an enclosed sea. It has very well-defined shores, and perhaps more than anything, it has a very over-determined history. So it may be that a thinking of the Mediterranean Sea really is too determined by the one. But I will just sort of very telegraphically list, I think in what Jeff talked about with Aristotle's many of the one could give us a way of refiguring the Mediterranean. And that would work because Greece is an archipelago. It's a different kind of relation of islands and seas. Or we had this morning, we had a few possibilities of reimagining Heidegger otherwise in relation of the many of the one. And I'll just mention there, because I can't resist them, in Francois' Fish, that you mentioned the fish, but it's a fish who is secure in a pool. So it's a fish in a river, not in the sea. You actually, in the quote you gave, it was a pool. And I was asking Rodrigo about this. Rodrigo quoted Heidegger using waves to describe rhythm, but they were waves that go back to the source. Unless I misheard you, but we can talk about it. So my sense is that Heidegger's water is very much rivers, but there are people in this room who can tell me I'm wrong about that. But I'm trying to think of ways that we could reimagine the water and reimagine the sea. And then finally, I'll just mention Philippe's wonderful paper this morning on Nietzsche, and all of those 1970s reference, 60s and 70s references to Nietzsche of a reconfiguration that would seem to very much give us a reconfiguration of the many and the one. Except the only thing I thought when you put the emphasis on Nietzsche's gestures, it's very hard to dance and leap on the sea if you're a human, is kind of the problem. Or the very last option, and I'm sorry I've gone a little over time, or what I wanted to go, is that we could also just change tack and sail out of the Mediterranean and head west, but to a different west, and to head to other seas, which we haven't really raised yet. So I'll end it there. So thank you.
Amanda.
Yeah, I have a question about what you think about another instance of the monolingualism of the other. It comes up in Learning to Live finally, I think, when he's dying, and he keeps saying, "I love my life, and I love everything that made me what I am." And that's the philosophical culture of the 60s, and then he just extends it out until it includes the Bible and Plato, all of the others that make him who he is and give him the life he loves, and the French language. And I'm always struck by the fact that he doesn't add the languages of Plato and the Bible, right? And then there's this moment at the end of the interview where he talks about his relation to French and why he loves it and how he loves it. He first says something like, "My interest is to leave traces in the French language," a hint of maybe a language to come. And the second thing he says is that he does this by respecting French a little abusively, and he always smiles at these younger writers who modify syntax, who make these changes. And the description, it's uncomfortable. The description is something like virgin boys given to premature ejaculation, while the French language awaits the next in line, with the implication that he's seducing her. He's seducing French, somehow. And so here we have a really striking moment of desire, and Geschlecht in his own dying, love letter, if you want, to French. I don't know. So that's more of a comment, I guess.
Think that's sort of a quick response. I think that is very continuous with the descriptions in monolingualism of what I was grouping under the first one of his own. Yeah. Because there he uses the language of seduction, but it's that I was seduced by French, harpooned, particularly by French literature is the thing he goes to as a teenager. He says it was French literature that wooed me, and that incited this desire and drew me up. And then I feel like the text does that hyperbolic move of a pursuit of purity that, because it's hyperbolic, becomes impure. But a very similar kind of language, but without the boys and the virgins lining up. I mean, that doesn't happen. But but it's not him seducing French, if I remember rightly in monolingualism. It's very much French harpooning him, seducing him and being seduced by French. So, yeah, I don't know if that changes too much. But I think that, and I guess, I think that more in that first one, which is going to be at work in the generalization, if that's the right way to describe the second move. Maybe that's a little...
Peggy was first. Peggy and then Dan.
Thanks a lot, Sam. There was a lot there to take in. So I want to respond to a number of different things. First, on promise in Geschlecht III, one of the things I find really interesting there, I think it's something no one's mentioned yet, but you got close to it, which is the moment at which, and it's around the question of promise, Derrida brings in speech act theory explicitly and says, of course, Heidegger wouldn't like this, to hear anything about, that pulls his thought towards speech act theory or even sets them in the same room together, right? And yet, Derrida insists quite, for several pages, as you recall, right around there, on the pertinence, nevertheless, to speak of a speech act theory. And as we know, Derrida is quite reserved about speech act theory. It's not that he takes it on wholeheartedly by any means, but finds it very useful for thinking through, at this moment, Heidegger's very limited, explicit invocation of promise as Versprechen, and he gives us several other places to look in Heidegger for thinking about promise. But so that's just one thing, and I wondered what others thought about that moment when you suddenly have J.L. Austin and Heidegger kind of in dialogue. The second thing was the passage you pointed to, which I also like a lot, and I'm glad you read it out, on veille and veiller. This is something I've thought about a lot and written about some, that this is a really precious notion in Derrida, and he has, there are very few texts of his, at least after a certain period, where he doesn't invoke the veille in all of its different, its polysemous possibilities. There's also, of course, la veille as in mourning, the wake for the dead, la veillée des morts, which is almost never absent when he invokes veiller. But it's especially, and he mentions it here, vigilance. And it's this very enlightenment value of critical vigilance, to be vigilant. So that was another thing. And the last thing is I called up a PDF of Monolingualism and was trying to follow along as you were reading. There is one, besides the footnote, the footnotes that you mentioned, the one about Hannah Arendt, but also the Jew, the German, that you mentioned too, which is a kind of, I think, sort of pointing to the seminar, obviously. Is it the next year of, or it's somewhere, I mean, you know, Herman, where it is in the sequence of the nationality.
This one is the
Two or
Topos,
three.
Mythos, Logos.
Right,
Yes,
so
that
it's the next
That's
Yeah.
the
year.
85, 86.
Right.
It's the
Right.
87, 88. That's the last, that's the fourth of that sequence.
Anyway, it's in that sequence. Besides that, there is one long quotation in Monolingualism. It's more than a page, and it's a quote from Hatibi
Yeah.
that he quotes in order to kind of point to the difference between his own monolingualism and what Hatibi celebrates as a bilingualism, famously in his book L'amour bilingue. So he doesn't really. You're right. I think that he's not working through the passage, from Hatibi. He kind of has set it up, then he quotes it, then he goes on to something else. But I think it is the only certainly extended quotation in that text. There are some proper names dropped, lots of proper names dropped here and there, and little kind of shards of quotation, but nothing extensive except for that one.
No, just thank you for all of that. I'm taking notes. But I just one quick comment on the speech act theory. That could be a multilingual moment in the kind I'm after and like, to bring in speech act theory, particularly looking at the way the words performative and things get translated into French in funny ways. And my sense, I haven't tracked this close enough actually, but my sense is Derrida, when he talks about it, usually he doesn't always will go with how it's actually, Austin is actually translated in French. He'll go with sort of much closer to the English. So that could be a way of bringing that in. And I just started thinking to myself, when Derrida mobilizes it as a tool against people, the only other place that comes to mind, but I'm having trouble thinking, is he does it against Kant as well, in Du droit de la philosophie, in reading, sort of organizing Kant's work on the university through thinking of it in the performative and constitutive distinction. Again, acknowledging this is not in Kant, it couldn't quite work, but just sort of bringing it in. And also at the same time, and saying, yes, this is a little insufficient, but actually getting it to do work for him. And I was just, maybe there are many other places where he uses those distinctions as a tool to really, but I was just wondering if it's just Germans. He ends up sort of bringing Austin against the Germans in some way. I'm not sure. But he's mostly reading German, so he's a Germanist.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Let's see if I can formulate this right. I wanted to maybe throw out a hypothesis on the monolingualism of the pedagogical scene as it's manifest in Geschlecht III. And what I was thinking, there's this kind of persistent stuttering in the text where he says, étranger, plutôt front. He keeps correcting himself somewhat theatrically. And it seems to me there's a kind of, let's see if I can describe this right, there's a necessary structural problem where at the very moment he's talking about Heidegger's philosophical nationalism, he's using French not as a language, but as a meta-language. That it structurally has to become transparent. And then he has to recall French back to its own idiomaticity. So there's sort of two Frenches in this sense. The French is occupying a kind of fictive space of universality as meta-language, and occupying a space of idiom as another language. And it seems to me there's all different ways you could describe this in terms of the operative in the thematic or even the 400 and 200. There's something about the impossibility of actually thematizing correctly how he's using French and how it defaults into a monolingual position. That's part of what's inciting this stuttering, is remembering that French is in fact a language and not the universal meta-language. Even as to be the philosophy professor, he has to treat French as a meta-language. I was just teaching Marx. I was thinking of the money commodity that somehow is not any of the other commodities. It's the one that gives value to all others or something like that. And it seems to me that part of the movement of the text one would have to account for is French being both a language and a meta-language. And one of the weird paradoxical things that happens is that actually then Heidegger's German being imported to the text as an example of philosophical nationalism actually becomes also Derrida's own resistance to his own linguistic nationalism. Very strange thing. So I want to throw that out to you as a hypothesis. The other thing I wanted to mention in passing is also in Memoir for Deman. No, I take it back. Not Memoir for Deman. In the Prolegomena to National Humanism text, he says even idioms are allocutions, which is I think the same way of saying there's no source languages, only target languages, that even what we think of as the untranslatable idiom is in fact a translation of some kind of otherness. Okay.
No, that's very helpful. The first point I think is really interesting and complicated, and I haven't actually. I've been thinking a bit about this, but not even that far. Like trying to just think about how I've been thinking about what happens to French when he's doing this kind of importation, but I haven't been thinking about so much how he's using French at these different levels and can't quite sustain it. Perhaps that's really helpful. Thanks.
I think we have time for one last question. Ian?
Right, thank you very much. I really like how you mapped Derrida's thinking about this temporal structure in Heidegger, then onto the problem of language. And I'm trying, and I also like the suggestion at the end that maybe we have to sort of go out to, I don't know, into the Atlantic Ocean or something, and leave the Mediterranean context behind. And I'm wondering what sort of type of literature it would be that we would look to. And so it wouldn't be Odysseus, obviously, where we have this return back home, and it wouldn't even be Aeneas, who's fleeing. There's a kind of exilic character. He's fleeing the destruction of Troy, but he has this destination. He has Rome to found. So I'm wondering, sort of, what would be the literature you'd look to develop that? It seems like it might be fleeing persecution, might be one way, some kind of exilic literature, or even something like the explorer who's not out to conquer, but just go out to sea, and maybe there will be a land, maybe there won't be. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, a couple of people have heard me talking about this over dinner and stuff. My thought is Caribbean literature, or the literature of the Americas.
Yes.
And so Glissant is working a lot here for me as a kind of thinking of the Caribbean as an archipelago, as a different kind of sea, and he's precisely in this kind of, and he has some rather polemical things about the Mediterranean, but I think, yeah, Caribbean literature, or I think the literature of the Americas in the plural could be interesting because it's a multilingual literature. The Caribbean, kind of the Glissant, has all of that at once, whether he, in his own writings or in other people's writings, and whether he carries it out in the right way or theorizes in the right way. It's nice though that it's in the West still. It's still in the West. It's always where you keep going west and you'll keep finding things. But yeah, that's the kind of short answer. And just to say though, I do think I am quite interested in returns, which some people are doing now. I mean, I sort of came across it in, just very quickly, Achille Mbembe's work, the Critique of Black Reason, which is sort of uneven in places. But one thing he does, and I don't think with even naming it as such, is he reads sort of Africa, sort of across the Sahara as an archipelago, using a Glissantian kind of language of archipelago, and they call camels ships of the desert for a reason. Like it kind of allows it to, there are ways of using archipelagic thinking and placing it in places we might not think, and I guess that's what I was maybe thinking when Daniel put up the Ceylon. It's like, oh, you could read that as an archipelago, you can read Europe as an archipelago, but why not Greece? Since it is actually, after all, and think about it that way. But that's a quick answer.
Let's thank Sam again.